Hello, I'm Generation 3DX. Welcome back to my series on creating beautiful art in Daz Studio. In this 7th part to the series, I'll be discussing the rendering process, including key settings that you need to know about to get balance to your final image, plus a discussion on what lengthens render times and how you can reduce them. So let's get straight into it. Today we have Rebecca joining us. Rebecca is from Spain, and if you were paying attention in the last video, you'll have seen her a couple of times. We've gone through all the process of setting up all our lights. We've got our model posed in the way that we want them to be, and we are now ready to actually render our final image. So there are quite a few things that you need to know about the rendering process. Now, I'm assuming that you're going to be using the HDRi hardware render, and you'll find this in the hardware tab. Your video card should be selected, since this is going to make an infinite amount of difference between having to do this or doing it in the CPU. If you don't have an NVIDIA card, you are going to be forced to use the CPU renderer in order to actually, if you want to use the HDRi engine. Okay, now this relies upon you having a scene that is not going to blow up your video card in terms of memory. If you go over your memory allocation, then the render will crash, it will stop. Now you can get around that by doing a CPU fallback. That does mean, however, that it's going to take a long time to do the render. So ideally, you always want to be working out how to limit the number of entities that are in your scene that could cause the texturing limit to go over to the memory of the card to be exceeded, and usually it is complex textures and surfaces that will be the arbiter on that. Okay, now I'm somewhat fortunate in that I have a powerful card which has got lots of memory, and there was only one render where I had 6 figures in one scene which made this blow up. And then I was forced to do a 12-hour CPU render in order to get it to work, because just simply the number of figures pushed it over that size. I've never had any other issues in 18 months of having this card. I've always been able to render my scenes quite comfortably within the memory of the card. So that's the first thing you have to be aware of, because it's literally an on-off proposition. If it goes over the memory allocation, it's hopeless. So you always want to be trying to keep within your graphics card memory. Okay, so in render settings, we are going to be primarily concerned with the editor tab. Okay. Now scroll. If we just have a no filter on this and we show all of them, there is a tremendous number of what seemingly a bewildering amount of settings. So let's just break these down. Firstly, we'll start with the general tab, and this has got your dimensions of your image. Okay, this is should be fairly straightforward. This will set your image aspect ratio and final pixel size. Okay, this is So there are other options here. I don't want to get into animation because animation is not part of this series, but this is where you would set up an animation, such as an image series or a movie. Okay, but for now we just stick to single still image in the current frame. Your render target will determine whether you want to go direct to file, which will and you put in your file name and your path, and then it would then render directly to the file, and you will not see the progress of the render. So I never use this. I always go with new window. In this way I can actually monitor the progress and make sure that everything's working correctly. Okay, auto headlamp, never ever have auto headlamp turned on. Okay, so next up is the render mode. Okay, I always have this on Photoreal. There is an interactive bias setting which will give you a slightly different look. It's more of a cartoony look, and it's supposed to be faster. But apart from in the very early days of Daz, I actually never used it. If you have the draw settings tab enabled, and to get if it's not showing up, then you just on your panes tab, you want the draw settings. Okay, so in draw settings, this determines not the final render, but the draw settings is what is displayed in your viewport. So here I've got my draw settings, draw mode, set to Photoreal. So this is going to be almost exactly how the final render is going to turn out. You want to see what interactive bias looks like, and the reason why I don't use it is because it looks like this. Now it does mean that you can move around the scene a lot quicker, especially if your video card is not as highly powered. Although that said, on a simple scene like this, there isn't really a huge amount of difference that I see between this and my if I've got it on full Photoreal. Okay, so that's interactive biased. Okay, you can play with it if you want, but I say I almost never use it because it just looks horrible. Yeah, that's a judgment. Okay, so going back to render settings. So that's your render mode. So now we have your progressive rendering. These settings, there's quite a lot here, and I tend to leave these on by default, and I never really have any problems. There are some times if I've got a particularly long render, I might want to reduce this down to a lower number. This one here, the rendering converge ratio, is how perfect you want the renderer to actually try to complete every single light, bounce, and so on. So again, with 95%, I always get what I want. And again, with rendering quality, if you increase that, it's supposed to increase the quality. I personally never use these. You're welcome to experiment with these, but I don't want to dwell on them because we have more important settings to talk about. This one is important. If you have a render that is just taking forever, and you might just want to limit it, this will limit it. Say this is the default is to 2 hours. I often set this to 1 hour because if my render is going over 1 hour, I've done something wrong, and so I don't usually want to be having a huge electricity bill for no apparent reason. So that is one that is very useful to have. There is this thing called post SSIM, and if you turn all this stuff on, it does a different way of trying to converge to the solution by just skipping all of the rendering qualities and just doing a predict target. Sometimes I've played with this, and you're welcome to play with it, and you might get a better results and a quicker render in doing so. I have personally not seen a big difference with it, so I just tend to have it turned off. Okay, so that's that. Okay, this is where we're getting into something very important. Okay, so tone mapping would always be enabled. This is all about the exposure of your image and the contrast of your image. Okay, so you can directly change this number here because this is the final number it's the only number that finally means anything. And all of these, the next three, your f-stop, your ISO, and your shutter speed, they are simply, if I move, for instance, the shutter speed, increase the shutter speed, obviously the exposure, the exposure value is going up, which means that the actual lightness or darkness of the image is actually, it's getting darker. So which is what you would expect in any normal camera. So with a 400th of a second shutter speed, she's gone very dim. If I reset that to 1/125th of a second, that's about right. Same by going in the opposite direction. If I make the shutter speed longer, the exposure value goes down and the image gets brighter. Okay, so, and again with ISO, sometimes I just use this because I want to pretend that I'm being a photographer, but the default is 100, and you can see with the 100 ISO it's not a very sensitive film, so that 125th shutter speed is creating a very dim image. Okay, if I just set that directly to 15, and that actually doesn't do it. Yeah, so what it's done is it's now adjusted the shutter speed to 512, which is interesting. So why it does it in that way is quite perplexing. Anyway, I say I never actually directly changed the exposure value. I have just gotten comfortable with making changes to ISO and the shutter speed, because that is something I can think with as a former photographer, and it usually gives me the result that I want. So that's controlling your overall exposure. Okay. The centimeter squared factor again appears to be an exposure control. If you just increase that, it makes it brighter. If you reduce it, it makes it dimmer. I never use it. Vignetting is a concept that is used to darken the limb or the outer part of a image. So with I don't think it actually works on the preview here. I really try to whack that up. Oh yeah, so it is doing some vignetting there. So it's darkening the surround of the image. If I reset that, yeah. So set that vignette to, I don't know, 10,000. Was that doing it? Yeah, there you go. So that is if you wanted to create a vignetting effect. I never use it. White point scale, I don't know what it does. I've never used it, never felt a need to use it. However, white point is important. Usually you want to have this set to 1, which is 1 across the board, which is white light. If you're getting a particularly yellow image because you're using lights or something that are yellow, you can change the white point to try to basically white balance, to do a correct white balance of the image. So if I was to select this kind of flesh color here, this should make it look more bluish. Yes, so that's what that's done, is it's made it look more bluish because it now thinks that's white, when of course it isn't. Okay, same conversely, if I was to go for blue, we'd get a much warmer image like that. So that might be useful in certain situations, and it's the same, it's having the same effect of what a camera would do, a digital camera, in trying to adjust the white balance there. But normally you would always only have that set to 1. Right, okay, this next one is actually really quite important, and it's something I do use a lot, which is burn highlights. Let's increase the reduce the shutter speed to make the image brighter. Okay, and we'll zoom in on. We'll just do a zoom in here, so we have a bit more flesh that we can work with. Look at a face, for instance. Okay, I'll just adjust that, just the dimensions there. Okay, so now going back to tone mapping, everything on the tonality of this, even with a relatively bright image, looks to be in balance. When I say in balance, we're not having anything that is blacker than black, and nothing that's whiter than white. What do I mean by that? If you were to look at the bright spots, for instance on the nose and the cheek, we've got some light spots there. If I keep increasing the exposure, reducing the shutter speed, eventually I'm going to get to the point where it's going to be oversaturated. And it's starting to look like that now, where we're getting some bleaching of the image. I won't say bleaching, but it looks like it's being oversaturated. Now you've got two options there. You can either reduce the exposure because you've just simply got it too bright, but they said there might be a reason why that's going, because you might have a lot of high contrast in your scene. You might have a shining light coming through a window or something like that, and if you reduce the exposure too much on the rest of the image, then you lose details on the image. The trick about doing the when you're faced with very high contrast in an image, and one could argue that this is potentially that because we've got a shadow effect on our chin here, is you can do burn highlights. Okay, so what burn highlights does, it is simply basically reducing the reducing the contrast on the image. Okay, so now it's the highlights have been reduced, and also and conversely crush blacks. Which way does it go? Yeah, it's this way. Yeah, they both go in the same direction. So this is reducing the blacks. Okay, I don't use this one as much. I use this one quite often. So again, if I go in the opposite direction to burn high, if I reset it, 0.25 is, see this, it's too contrasty. Now you really want to see how crazy it is. This is obviously, now if you wanted to create an effect like that, that's fine, but anybody would tell you that image is damaged at this point, or would be damaged on the final render, because you're losing information. So you can, well, I'll fix it in Photoshop. You cannot fix that in Photoshop because you probably overloaded the histogram of the brightness levels of the image. Okay, so again, you can just reduce. You could reduce the increase the make the shutter speed faster, or you can do burn highlights. Okay, so it's something that a lot of you may not know about, but it's one thing I discovered, and it's been my friend, essentially, to do that. Right. Okay. So that's the burn highlights. Saturation is pretty obvious. It's just how much color the render feels you need to put in. And again, I almost never need to mess with this unless you were trying to create a very specific kind of bleached effect, or you were going for some kind of, I don't know, 1960s psychedelic overload. Again, I almost never use it. I've never had a reason to mess with the gamma levels either. I mean, why would you? I mean, it looks horrible if you do that, and clearly that the gamma is wrong. Okay, but I don't know, maybe there's a use for it. They put the setting in. Okay, so that's everything there is to know about tone mapping, and it's something that you always want to do before you do final render, is to review everything, ensure that you've got the correct exposure. You're not losing information in the image by having too bright highlights or too dark shadows, and that is 90% of the time you're going to be using. These other settings are very rarely used. Okay, tone mapping, that's it. So finally, onto environment. This is more to do with on the subject of lighting. You know, if you recall my lighting tutorial, I talked about scene only, dome and scene, and so forth. So you shouldn't be going into this tab for your final rendering setups. This is something that you set up when you set up your scene. So not really relevant to this discussion. Right, so with everything ready to go, we can run the render. So we're saying render target, new window, and we're ready to go. Let's click the render button. So we get a pop-up, we get progress and a pop-up, and I'm sure you've seen these, so I don't really need to belabor this. So let's just watch this render do its thing, and we'll come back. Alright, and there it is. That's the final render. And then we can just go ahead and save that. And here's the final image. So that took a little bit longer than I expected, and I think the reason for it is because there's quite a bit of detail going on this dress. There's a certain shimmer effect on that, and that leads us kind of quite nicely into discussing what is going to be lengthening or shortening your render times. Okay, so it's quite a big subject. I'm just going to give my own observations, and certainly not a scientific analysis of this. Okay, first things is to think about, as just mentioned there, is the complexity of your scene in terms of number of surfaces that will be reflecting light. And that is the key, because iRay is all about light rays, okay, and how they bounce around and reflect and interact with different objects. The more objects that you have in your scene, and the more complex those objects are, then the longer the render time is going to take. So if we doubled, for instance, this scene, if we doubled this from 1 figure to 2, I would anticipate that it wouldn't double the length of time, but it would certainly increase it. And if we had 5 figures in the scene, then you can certainly expect significantly longer render time, because figures are complex, especially with the eyes. You've got reflections to do with eyes, and they'll be wearing clothes. Well, we hope they're wearing clothes, but if they weren't wearing clothes, they still have some details on them, and skin reflections and so forth, which is going to add to your iRay render times. The next thing to think about after number of actual objects in the scene is the number of lights in the scene and what type of lights they are. In this particular render, we've been using a classical 3-point lighting system. It is the Rembrandt style I've got going on here, and I find that for simple studio setups like this with a single model, I can get really fast renders, because there's just 3 lights, a single figure, a simple backdrop, boom, And I do actually spend a lot of my time creating these figures, creating these renders, because my emphasis, I guess, is my characters, and isn't so much like with other artists where you might be looking at the actual scene, or some kind of fantasy scene, or some real life scene or something like that. Okay, so talking of the lights, let's just turn off these lights, and we're going to go with an HDRi dome instead. Okay, and if you're wondering what that is, then you didn't see my lighting demo. So we'll turn off our studio lights. We'll go to environment, and we'll set to dome only, and just rotate that. So now we're using a dome, and that's our lighting there. Okay, so we don't have any studio lights, no lights in the scene that are on. So we just use that dome light, and just let's see how quickly that's going to render. Right, so that was less than half the time, and using an HDRi dome light. So that was an interesting exercise. And generally speaking, I have found that an HDRi in a simple setting like this will actually be faster than a three-point lighting studio lights. But there is a caveat here with HDRi domes. If I was to load a scene in with Rebecca now, and I'm going to actually have a building with windows. Okay, I'm going to have the HDRi light coming in through the windows. You're going to see how it's going to change matters entirely. Okay, let me do that now. Okay, so I've loaded in a scene and put Rebecca in a position, adjusted the exposure settings, stripped out everything that there is in this architectural add-on here. Okay, so we've just literally got skylight, windows, removed all the furniture, and everything. Okay, now there are some emissives in here. I should probably turn off those as well. Okay, so I've disabled the lights that are coming in from the emissives. So now we should only have the light that's coming in through the skylight and the windows. Okay, and that does look like it's just those that are coming in. And we can already see on the preview that it's having a harder time actually starting to fill out or putting the detail in on this, and that gives us a clue straight away that this render is going to take longer. So what we'll do is we'll just get this going, and we'll run it for about 3 or 4 minutes, and we'll just see how far it gets on the actual final render. Alright, so we're at 4 minutes in here, and we still haven't even managed to poke through the 30% barrier on the convergence. Now you recall before on the HDRi dome, exact same dome, but without the building, it finished the entire render in less than 2 minutes. Okay, now the reason for this is because, and you can kind of see it a little bit in the softness that's going on here. There's some kind of ambient reflection, not ambient, but there's reflections going on from the light that's coming in through the window, and the light's coming in from the skylight is reflecting around the walls and the floor of the building, and it's only letting a certain amount of light in. So the iRay renderer is having to do a lot more work to figure out how to bounce that light around. Okay, so if you really want to create this effect of some soft natural light that's entering a room or a building, and there's certainly going to be valid cases for that. In fact, I have done renders that have created that soft lighting effect, and it is quite beautiful, but you have to be prepared for potentially quite significantly long render times. But something to bear in mind, that if you're forcing an HDRi light dome in through openings and windows and so on, be prepared for longer render times. Okay, so we're back to the very first one that we had with it, which we had a 3 light in a simple studio with the 3-point lighting system going, and we got a render time of about I think it was about 4 or 5 minutes. Okay, what I want to demonstrate here is if I'm going to add a load of different extra lights and just see how adding extra lights in is going to lengthen the render time, because there's simply going to be more emissive surfaces that have to follow the tracing of those light rays around. So I'll do that now. Okay, so I've added 12 point lights. So there's a lot of different lights going on here, which means potentially a lot of information has to be processed. So let's just run, and we'll leave the studio lights on as well, the spotlights on, and then we'll just see how long this takes to render. So just a general comment, if you're wondering why the lights aren't showing up on the render, it's because they are, I've got them on the set to points, so they don't actually have any geometry, so that's why they're invisible, but they're certainly emitting light. Alright, so that's practically the same render time, despite adding 12 point lights. Think, okay, how is that even possible? If we go, as I intimated, if we go and look at the light profile, the light geometry is set to point on all of these. Okay, so point lights, if you're going to have point lights in a scene, it's much more efficient. It's going to be very efficient just to have that light geometry set to point. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to change these to a sphere. I'm going to change all of them to a sphere. So we've got those spheres coming through now, the point lights as spheres. I mean, I just turned off the studio lights to confirm they actually are producing light, and they are. And they're creating quite a nice, interesting looking effect there. But we'll put the studio lights on for control in this experiment. So turn those back on, and then we'll run the render again. So now in this case we can actually see them coming through on the final render, because they actually have a shape, they have a geometry, and that's a sphere. Well, that was a surprising result. I thought that would take longer, and it's basically taken the same amount of time. So we'll save that image. And that actually demonstrates to us that point lights are actually very efficient and don't affect render times. So what does then? Now, what I do believe is that it's emissive surfaces, which scenes, environments that you buy on the marketplace are plagued with them, and they look fantastic. But I do believe that they do add to render time significantly. The way to demonstrate that in this laboratory setting is I'm going to create, we delete the point lights, and I'm going to create a series of bars, primitives, and I'm going to assign them as an emissive surface. So I'm going to create a dozen of those, and then let's just see where we go. So to create an emissive, let's put the array on here. So to create an emissive surface, I'm actually going to turn off these so we can see what we're doing here a bit better and see the effect that it's going to create. So going to surfaces, I'm on this, let's just call this strip light emissive. So we go into our surfaces tab, and we scroll down. Actually, don't know what the shader is going to be on here, but let's see if we can get an emissive. We can get an emission. So we're doing emission color. Just use white. Right, there we go. And we give it a luminance. I think you have to use quite high luminance figures on these emissives. There we go. That's actually kind of bright, that one. Let's try to turn that down a bit. That'll do. Great, so now we've got our strip light there. So let's just make a whole load of those, duplicate those, and see where we go. Okay, so there we have a studio now filled with these impossibly positioned fluorescent lights that are on each side of Rebecca. All emissives. Very interesting effect is created there. But the proof of the pudding is going to be in the eating, so let's see how long it takes to do this render. So that was a surprise. Only 3 minutes and 30 seconds. Actually was faster than the standard point lights. I thought emissives would actually drag out the render time. They didn't in this case. So it does appear that emissives aren't actually the problem. What seems to be the issue with dragging out render times is the HDRi dome. And I think in terms of getting through restrictions, I suspect that if I was to put a barrier between these emissives or put some additional surfaces around in the scene, it would probably lengthen the time further. But anyway, this is something you can potentially experiment with and just be aware of and see for yourself what lengthens times, what lengthens the render times and what doesn't. Okay, so I think that covers it for this video. I hope it's been useful to understand which settings in the renderer are key to a good balanced final image, and how you can keep your render times down by varying the number of elements in the scene and how light is restricted and created in the scene. In the next video, I'll be covering a subject that almost no one else in the Daz space is talking about, and that is the correct use of color and how it can enhance the beauty of your rendered scenes. If you enjoyed this video or found it useful, please like and subscribe and leave a comment. You can learn more about my art by following me at Generation 3DX on DeviantArt. I'll see you in the next video.